It was supposed to be another uneventful day of digging. I was halfway through a summer of boring, sweaty afternoons spent working in old Mrs. Henderson's backyard, turning soil to make way for her vegetable garden. Honestly, it wasn't the worst job in the world. I mean, it could have been worse. At least I was outdoors and not stuck in some stuffy office or flipping burgers like some of my friends. Still, at 17, this wasn't exactly the adventure-filled summer I had imagined. Most days, I'd throw in my earbuds, listen to some random playlist, and mindlessly dig my way through the hot afternoons, just counting down the hours until I could go home and cool off. But on that day, everything changed. It was a hot Wednesday afternoon, and I had been working on Mrs. Henderson's backyard project for a couple of weeks by then. She was the kind of old lady who watched you like a hawk, making sure you weren't slacking off. But to be fair, she was nice enough, always offering me lemonade and cookies when I needed a break. She paid well too, and for a summer gig, I couldn't really complain. I was halfway through digging up a new patch when the tip of my shovel hit something solid. At first, I thought it was a rock. Her yard was full of them, but this one sounded different, more metallic. I stopped and crouched down, brushing away the loose soil with my hand. My fingers touched something cold and hard, and as I cleared the dirt away, I noticed it was longer than a rock for sure. I scraped more soil off, and my heart jumped. It was a sword, a real metal sword buried under the ground. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of replica or prop. I mean, who the hell finds an actual sword in their neighbor's backyard? But as I pulled more of it from the earth, I realized this wasn't some cheap Halloween decoration. It was heavy, rusted in places, but still sharp, and the hilt had intricate engravings I couldn't quite make out because of the dirt. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at it, my heart racing. My imagination ran wild. Was this thing centuries old? Could it have been from the medieval times? How the hell did it end up in Mrs. Henderson's backyard? I wiped the sweat off my brow and looked around, checking to see if anyone had noticed. Mrs. Henderson was inside, probably watching her afternoon soaps. I could hear them faintly through the screen door. No one was around. The backyard was quiet, except for the distant hum of a lawnmower from a few houses down. I stared at the sword, my brain whirling. I knew what I should do. Tell Mrs. Henderson. Maybe she'd know more about it, or at the very least, she'd call someone who would. But part of me didn't want to. This was a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. What if I could keep it for myself? After all, I found it. Who would even know? I could sell it. If it was really old, it could be worth a fortune. Or I could keep it and show it off to my friends. How many people can say they have a legit medieval sword? I stood there for what felt like forever, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted to do. My hand gripped the hilt, and I imagined what it would feel like to swing it around. The cool metal seemed to hum with a strange kind of energy, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be found. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't just leave it in the ground. I dragged it out completely, careful not to damage it further, and brushed off the remaining dirt. The blade was long, about 3 feet, and despite the rust, it was in decent condition. I had seen enough medieval movies and video games to know this wasn't your average sword. I knew I needed more information. There was no way I could keep this thing to myself without knowing what it was. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures, figuring I could do some research later. Still, the temptation was strong to just wrap it up in a towel, throw it in my backpack, and walk away. Mrs. Henderson would never know. But I hesitated. Something about it didn't feel right. This sword wasn't mine to take. It wasn't like finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. This was history, and I wasn't sure what kind of history it was yet. For all I knew, it could be some national treasure, and stealing it would land me in serious trouble. After what felt like an eternity of internal debate, I made a decision. I couldn't keep this thing to myself. No matter how much I wanted to, I had to do the right thing. I glanced at Mrs. Henderson's house again and sighed. This was going to be awkward. I carefully carried the sword up to her porch, feeling like some kind of medieval knight returning from battle. When I knocked on her door, it took her a minute to answer. She peered out from behind the screen, looking slightly confused at the sight of me holding a rusty sword. "Is that part of the garden equipment?" she asked, squinting. Not exactly," I replied. "I found this while I was digging. I think it might be, old." She stepped out, her eyes widening as she took a closer look. "Good heavens, where did that come from?" I showed her the spot where I had dug it up, explaining how I had hit something hard and discovered the sword. Mrs. Henderson, to her credit, didn't seem upset. In fact, she seemed just as intrigued as I was. "I've lived in this house for 40 years, she said, shaking her head. "Never knew something like that could be buried in the backyard. My late husband used to dig around there too. He never found anything like this." We stared at the sword together for a while, neither of us sure what to do next. The next day, Mrs. Henderson made a few phone calls, and before I knew it, a small team of archaeologists showed up at her houses. I had no idea this kind of thing could happen so fast, but apparently, finding an ancient sword in someone's backyard is a pretty big deal. They set up some equipment and started digging in the area around where I had found the sword. I couldn't believe how quickly this had all escalated, from me casually digging a garden to having an entire archaeological team in Mrs. Henderson's yard. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. They didn't find much else in terms of artifacts, just a few broken pottery pieces and some other random bits of metal. But the sword was the real prize. After some initial analysis, the lead archaeologist, Dr. O'Neill, told us it was likely from the 14th or 15th century, medieval, just as I had suspected. The engravings on the hilt were still a mystery. They had to be carefully cleaned and studied, but Dr. O'Neill believed they could be a family crest or a maker's mark. The sword had likely been buried for centuries, possibly even during a battle or some kind of local conflict. Once the archaeologists finished their initial work, they took the sword to a lab for further study. Mrs. Henderson seemed happy to let them take it, and honestly, I was relieved. The temptation to keep it for myself had been overwhelming at first, but now I was glad I hadn't given in. This thing was way bigger than me, and it deserved to be properly cared for and studied. A few weeks later, Dr. O'Neill called Mrs. Henderson with some updates. The sword was indeed medieval, likely from the late 14th century, and the engravings on the hilt were identified as a noble family's crest, though the details were still being worked out. It wasn't just any old sword. It had belonged to someone important. The local historical society got involved, and soon there was talk of displaying the sword in a nearby museum. Mrs. Henderson was thrilled at the idea, and she even invited me to come along to the opening of the exhibit when it was ready. Looking back, I'm proud of the decision I made. Sure, I could have tried to sneak off with the sword, maybe even sold it to someone online for a quick payday. But doing the right thing felt better in the end. I had been part of something bigger than myself, something that connected me to history in a way I never expected. Plus, I still had a great story to tell. Every time I hang out with my friends, I get to say, "Remember that time I found a medieval sword in my neighbor's backyard?" And that's pretty damn cool. That summer jobs at Mrs. Henderson's wasn't just a way to make some extra cash anymore. It became a turning point. Finding that sword opened my eyes to the fact that history wasn't just something you learned about in school, it was all around us, buried beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered.